a quick and brief introduction of the speaker. So mostly I would like to introduce him through the work that he is doing, which is absolutely fascinating. Professor Amitabh Joshi studies and teaches evolutionary biology at Jawaharlal Nehru Center for Advanced Studies and Research in Bengaluru. So he is a fellow of Indian Academy of Sciences, then INSA, NASI, and Indian Society of Evolutionary Biologists. He is deeply interested in the evolutionary process per se, rather than this or that taxon or trait complex. This is something that I have lifted from his own website, where he talks about his own work. I thought that's the best way to introduce him to the rest of the world. As a corollary, he is primarily interested in conceptualizations, not organisms. This is something we rarely come to appreciate in biology. Biology and biologists are always about organisms, and here is Professor Amitabh Joshi, who is interested in conceptualizations, and organisms happen to be there naturally. So to him, understanding organisms is a means to refining our conceptualizations, and it's not the other way. So this is a big paradigm shift in doing biology, especially evolutionary biology, as we are all taught and brought up. His group primarily does experimental research, but also does some theory, both analytical and simulation based. So this is a new facet of biology, which perhaps started with in his generation, which is a very short time period in biology research. So this use of analytical and simulation tools in biology is pretty new, and Professor Amitabh Joshi is one of the pioneers in this particular area. So his group is a world leader in the study of density dependent selection and its role in affecting population dynamics and stability. He also works on core conceptual issues in evolutionary theory, and as part of the informal Foundations of Genetics and Evolution group, together with his colleague Professor T.N.C. Vidya and their alumni Professors N.G. Prasad and Sutirth De, they work on these conceptual issues, this particular group, and Professor Amitabh Joshi is the founder member of this. This work has major elements of the history, sociology, and philosophy of science to it. So these are very interesting aspects of biological research which we rarely come across, and we're happy that Professor Amitabh Joshi is here. And one of the interesting things, two interesting things before I fold up, he has very serious interests in poetry, especially in Urdu, Persian, and English, philosophy, history, and military science. In fact, it has been a pleasure for me personally to read his editorials in Resonance Journal, which would be replete with quotations from great works from Persian and Urdu, and he is a master himself in that, in addition to being a top-class evolutionary biologist. And the last thing, which I found out in the course of preparing for this introduction, a newly described ant species found in the Periyar Tiger Reserve of Kerala has been named Usiriya Joshi in his honor. This was just about 2 years back. And finally, I like this particular quote that he mentions in his write-up on his web page. I do not view science as a career. So especially for youngsters here, it's a very interesting takeaway. I do not view science as a career. I view it the way a classical musician would view music. So how does a classical musician view music? So that is what he will be demonstrating through his thoughts and talk on this very interesting title, what is natural selection and why it is not, like many of us believe, survival of the fittest. Sir, we welcome you once again and request you to please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Madhusudan, for that lovely introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here at the Planetarium. After a few years, I've been somewhat regularly coming here to teach during their various summer programs, and it's always a pleasure to be here. A few words before I really get into the meat of the talk. Why this focus on natural selection for a general audience such as this one? I think the reason is that natural selection is a concept that is extremely simple or almost simplistic, and therefore it is easy to imagine that we understand what natural selection is and how it works, because it is so simplistic in its conception. And often some of the nuances that make it complicated in the way it actually plays out, although it is so simple in conception, those nuances sometimes get lost, and we end up describing natural selection with this very pithy phrase coined by Herbert Spencer, not by Charles Darwin, the survival of the fittest, which somehow suggests that if you can identify a type of individual, a type of organism as being the fitter or the fittest, then they will increase and come to predominate numerically in the population. That is taken for granted, but actually the reality is not that straightforward. And so because natural selection is easy to misunderstand, and having misunderstood it, it's been historically used to support all kinds of fairly nasty socio-political ideologies. For that reason, I thought this might be an interesting topic for a general audience to appreciate perhaps some of the nuances about natural selection. Also, natural selection is not just something that happens in the living world. It transcends biology in many ways. It's something that happens all the time. When you choose to shift your money from one bank account to another bank account because of a slightly better interest rate, natural selection is happening also. When certain computer viruses multiply faster than others on the internet, natural selection is happening there too. So it's not just in biology that it happens. So with that, let's begin with what Charles Darwin actually first said about natural selection. So this is from the chapter 4 of his first book on evolution, The Origin of Species, and he says that if variations useful to any organic being do occur, so he's talking about trait variants, assuredly individuals thus characterized will have the best chance of being preserved in the struggle for life, and from the strong principle of inheritance. Please note that phrase. They will tend to produce offspring similarly characterized. This principle of preservation I have called, for the sake of brevity, natural selection. This is the first statement about natural selection that anybody ever saw in the world. So what exactly is Darwin saying here? There are a couple of interesting points to note. One is that he is talking about the strong principle of inheritance. So one interesting point is that already you see that heredity has come into his primary description of natural selection itself. And please recollect that this book was published in 1859. This was before Gregor Mendel's work on modern day genetics as we understand it was widely known. So at that time, the mechanism of heredity was not known. Nobody knew about genes and so on. But you notice that the concept heredity appears in that very definition of selection. And why did he call it natural selection? This was by analogy to the experience of plant and animal breeders who practiced selection to cause varieties to develop characteristics that were of interest to humans. So from the beginning, this was by analogy to plant and animal breeding, with which Darwin was very familiar. Now, one thing that is often missed out, people are all familiar with the first book, The Origin of Species, but there are actually 4 books of Darwin's that are very relevant to understanding his thoughts on selection and evolution. The Origin of Species itself, 2 volumes of the variation of animals and plants under domestication. This is where the analogy with breeding is made in great detail. And finally, the last book, The Descent of Man, in which he also deals with issues like sexual selection, that is selection operating not through differences in survival, but differences in the ability to acquire mates and reproduce. And in this book he also talks about the possibility of selection sometimes acting between groups of individuals rather than just between individuals within a population. So the central insight of selection, and apart from that first quote from Darwin, what I am now going to say, I am going to sort of cast Darwin's words in more modern terminology rather than his terminology. So essentially what Darwin's insight was that individuals better suited to make a living and reproduce in a given ecological scenario will have offspring that tend to resemble them. So if you have multiple kinds of individuals in a population of a species, some of them have some variant of some characteristic or trait compared to others, and those that have certain variants are, because of those variants, better able to survive, better able to reproduce, basically better able to function in that environment. They will tend to produce more offspring than those who are not so successful in the ecological struggle in that environment. And because of the strong principle of heredity, if you recollect the previous quote, their offspring will tend to share those variant traits that made them successful. Therefore, over a period of time, those traits that made them better suited in that ecological scenario will become more numerically common in the population, eventually leading to substantial changes in the makeup or the composition of the population, potentially leading to the formation of new species. So this was the basic idea of natural selection, and let us recollect that the natural selection was an attempt to try to explain why species look so adapted to the ecological conditions they typically inhabit. If you look at any species, by and large, they seem to have characteristics that make them well suited to the particular lifestyle or the particular context in which they lead their lives. So key points in Darwin's formulation of natural selection. The first point is that natural selection is a process in which heredity links the success of a type in the struggle for existence. So one can think of ecological success. Which type of individual in this population is more successful at surviving and reproducing in its ecological context? This is ecological success, and this is reflected in offspring production. Heredity then links ecological success to the greater representation of that type in the future, in the next generation, which is evolutionary success. So, in the process of natural selection, heredity actually occupies a key role. It is what links ecological success to evolutionary success. If heredity was not there to ensure that the offspring of the quote unquote fittest parents resembled them and not other individuals, ecological success by being more fit to your environment would not translate into evolutionary success. So heredity is very, very crucial here. Second point is just saying that the process of natural selection encompasses heredity, and heredity is important. This is not often recognized outside the immediate field, but Darwin contributed to changing the way we conceptualize heredity. Prior to Darwin, heredity was all about similarity. In some sense, heredity was what transmitted the essence of a species to its offspring. In other words, heredity, if you like, explained why the offspring of a crow would always be a crow and not suddenly mysteriously become a myna. It was explaining the similarity of the species type prior to Darwin. Darwin basically developed the idea that heredity not only has to explain why the offspring of a crow is always a crow, but also has to explain variation, not just similarity. Why do some crows that have a beak which is 3 inches long, nevertheless have some progeny with a beak that is 2.5 inches long, some progeny which have 4 inches long. So heredity also needs to explain these variations within a species. And Darwin implicitly focused on heredity as reflecting the degree of parent-offspring similarity in what we would today call the phenotype. This idea of Darwin's is more implicit than explicit. It was explicitly developed about 20 years later by his cousin Francis Galton. The notion that heredity should be thought of as anything, regardless of the actual mechanism, that tends to make offspring resemble their parents more than they would resemble some randomly drawn member of the population. And please note, in this case, if you look at heredity like this, heredity can be due to genes being shared between parents or offspring, or due to other things like environments being shared between parents and offspring in species with parental care, or behaviors being shared between parents and environment because we learn them from our parents. This point we'll come to in a little bit. It will become important that natural selection was conceived by analogy to plant and animal breeding, and that natural selection was conceived of in terms of one or a few traits at a time, just as breeders do. Basically, when a breeder is trying to breed for, let's say, larger body size in a species, what they do is they focus on that one trait, body size. They choose the largest individuals in the population to breed from and don't allow the smaller individuals to breed. Now, the larger individuals they have chosen, they may have some variation at other traits among themselves also, but the breeder is focused on that one trait. And that is the view that was taken by Darwin when thinking about natural selection. So this is just to exemplify that if you look at the experience of breeders, see, these are all one species. All these different varieties of dog, from the Dachshund to the Boxer, are all one species. These 4 pigeons are from my terrace. There are about 9 different coat color variants of pigeons in my terrace, which are the product or remnants of past generations of pigeon breeding, which was very popular in India. These are all the same species, and this is the typical so-called wild type species. These are all bred varieties. All these vegetables are the same species. So you can magnify a lot of diversity and give rise to new varieties by selection. This is the experience of breeders, and this is achieved over a few hundred years, not a very, very long period of time. So Darwin's well-known contributions that everybody is sort of familiar with is that he gave us the notion of descent with modification. In other words, that different species are connected by ancestor-descendant relationships. And the second, of course, is that natural selection is a mechanism for adaptive evolution that tends to make species better adapted to their environments. Both of these are what most people think of and what textbooks mention as Darwin's great contributions. But actually, these were not really unique or new to Darwin. He did stress them. Descent with modification was already a well accepted notion for almost 150 years before Darwin in the scientific circles, in biological circles. There is nothing new about it. Natural selection also was not, as a broad concept, not entirely new. Ideas very similar to natural selection were put out at least as early as 600 BC in ancient Greece by Empedocles and others, picked up during Roman times by Lucretius and others. In the 9th century AD, the Egyptian thinker Al-Jahiz was talking about mechanisms very much like selection. In the 13th, 14th century in eastern Iran, Nasiruddin Tusi was talking about mechanisms very similar to natural selection. Nasiruddin Tusi actually explicitly made the point, so did Jahiz, that human beings were likely descended from some species of African ape. What is interesting to note in present context is that both Al-Jahiz and Nasiruddin Tusi, who were operating within the framework of the Islamic world at the time, were also very renowned as Islamic scholars and theologians and Islamic jurisprudents. So evidently in those supposedly backward era, people didn't mind religious scholars talking about humans being descended from apes, etc., whereas nowadays that's not entirely the case. So, interesting point. So, these were actually not the novel, unique contributions of Darwin. We have argued that Darwin's unique contribution was actually operationalizing natural selection in a particular way, giving us a particular explanation of how exactly natural selection works. And this has 4 elements to it. The first is the so-called atomization of the individual into traits. This is not my phrase, this is a phrase used by Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin in a criticism of certain aspects of evolutionary thought. And the criticism says that in evolution we are thinking of the organism one trait at a time as if we have atomized it into traits, but we should be thinking of the organism as a holistic entity, because it is the whole organism that goes about its life, that forages for food and finds a mate and so on, and we'll address this point in a little bit. This was one of Darwin's unique contributions. Also reconceptualizing heredity as transmitting variations as well as similarities, as I just said. Differentiating between the developmental expression of traits and their hereditary transmission. This is very important and also not much noticed. See, prior to Darwin, the science of embryology, what we today call as developmental biology, how does a single fertilized egg differentiate and grow into a complex organism with different kinds of tissues, etc. In Darwin's time, heredity was considered as a part of embryology. And Darwin made the point based on the fact that certain traits often skip a generation before they are seen again. This was a well-known phenomenon. In his days it was called reversion. And Darwin interpreted this in a very interesting way. He said the fact that you can have a trait in the grandparental generation, then it disappears in the parental generation, then it reappears in the grand offspring generation. What this means is that the actual expression of the trait in the body is independent of its transmission to the offspring. And you can delink the process of hereditary transmission from the developmental process of creating an organism that actually expresses these traits out of a fertilized egg. This is a huge contribution of Darwin's, which again was more explicitly developed by Galton in the 1880s, which is often not entirely credited to him. And finally, Darwin realized this very, very fundamental, nuanced thing about selection, that although selection acts on individuals, after all, selection is happening because some individuals are ending up producing more offspring than others. And it is the entire individual that reproduces. It is not the individual's body size that reproduces or the individual's hair color that reproduces, the entire individual. So selection does act on individuals, but as a result of that, individuals don't transmit themselves to the next generation as they are unless you have some form of asexual reproduction. So, as a consequence of selection acting on individuals, it is trait variants that are consequently differentially transmitted to the offspring, and eventually as a result it is the species or the population whose composition is changed. This is explicitly there even in Darwin's first book, and it is the most nuanced understanding of all the aspects of selection that you can imagine. I mean, we haven't improved on this in any way in the next 170 years. So, I'm now going to talk a little bit about three different conceptions of natural selection. So, sometimes you might have heard that natural selection was first proposed by simultaneously but independently by Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace in 1858. And of course, Herbert Spencer also talked about natural selection and indeed came up with the term survival of the fittest. But when we talk about evolutionary understanding today, we often say Darwinian explanation of evolution, not the Darwin-Wallacean explanation. There's a reason for that. It's not because Wallace was not as upper class as Darwin, as some sociologists have argued. It is simply that the conceptions of natural selection of these three people actually differed somewhat. They were broadly similar, but there were some differences. And it is the Darwinian conception which seems to be closest to reality. Darwin, I mean, I'm summarizing a more nuanced debate in slightly extreme terms, but Darwin really believed that most of the time selection is primarily acting between individuals within a population and on trait variants. It's the trait variants that are being differentially transmitted. By contrast, Wallace believed that selection primarily acted not between individuals but between competing varieties of a species. This was explicitly a sort of a between variety selection that Wallace had in mind. And Wallace, for example, also believed that understanding domestication or plant and animal breeding was irrelevant to understanding evolution in the wild. And of course, Darwin built up his whole conception of selection by analogy to plant and animal breeding. Herbert Spencer took objection to Darwin's focus on individual trait variants, on this way of looking at a trait at a time the way a breeder would, and said selection not only acts primarily between individuals, but it acts on entire individuals considered holistically. And therefore, instead of asking about a trait and whether an individual carrying this variation of this trait is having higher fitness than an individual carrying another variation, what you need to do is take the entire individual and say this individual is fitter than that individual, and that is what selection is acting on. And that is the context in which he coined the term survival of the fittest. So his fittest referred to a complete individual, not taken one trait at a time. This was the major difference between Spencer's view. And once fittest was conceived in this way, if you could take a holistic individual and say this guy, I taken in my totality am fitter than you. From there, it's a very easy step to saying my ethnic group taken in its totality is superior or fitter than your ethnic group. That jump becomes very, very easy. And which is why the Spencerian variant is what caught on and was used by political figures, social figures to justify various supremacist socio-political ideologies, whether it be colonialism or Nazism and so on. Now, the problem with this is that if you consider individuals holistically, as Spencer was arguing, we end up with what you might call the infinite individuals problem. And this problem is the following. See, if you imagine how many traits there are in an individual, let's be simple, let's say each individual has 1,000 traits. That's an underestimate. And let's say each trait has 10 possible variants, right? That's again an underestimate. what is the total number of types of individuals that are then possible? It's an astronomically large figure, right? 1000 traits, 10 variants of each trait. So 10 raised to the 1000. It's an astronomically large figure. So basically, for all practical purposes, every individual considered holistically is unique. Whereas if we focus at a trait at a time, I can combine groups of people. I can divide this entire group of people sitting here into those that are above 5 feet 4 inches tall and those that are below 5 feet 4 inches tall. Two types, right? But otherwise, each of us is unique. Now the problem is, if I want to understand and explain scientifically evolutionary change, I want some way of describing how the population is changing over time, over generations. I need a dynamic description of change. But if I consider every individual holistically, there is one unique set of unique individuals. Next generation, there is a different set of equally unique individuals. So there is no explanation there. There is just the fact that every generation you will have a unique set of individuals. Whereas, if I can divide us into short and tall individuals and show that tall individuals are producing more offspring, then I can actually dynamically track over generations that the proportion of tall individuals in this population is increasing over time. I get around the infinite individuals problem. So what exactly is natural selection now that we've had all this backdrop? And in order to get to this, let's talk about something that most people, except for perhaps some of the youngest members of this audience, should be quite familiar with, which is bank accounts, right? We are all familiar with bank accounts and interest and so on. So supposing we imagine a situation where I have 20,000 rupees, I put 10,000 rupees into an SBI account and I put 10,000 rupees into a Canara Bank account, and the interest rates are different. SBI is giving me 5%, Canara Bank is giving me 10%. Let me be very clear, this is not to say that Canara Bank is better. I have made up these numbers. They could be the other way around. Now, the first thing to consider is what is the average interest rate that my money is earning on an average. It's basically 10,000 by 20,000, that is 1/2 at the rate of 5% plus 1/2 at the rate of 10%, which comes to 7.5%. It's the average of 5 and 10%, right? Because there is equal amount of money in both the bank accounts. Secondly, the share of Canara Bank deposit is 10,000 out of 20,000 rupees, which is 50% of my money is in Canara Bank. Now, let's say this goes on for 1 year. What is the situation in the next year? That 10,000 in SBI has become 10,500, 10,000 in Canara Bank has become 11,000. Interest rate is still 5% and 10%. But now consider what is my average interest rate. 10,500 out of the new total of 21,500 into 5% plus 11,000 divided by the new total into 10%. My average interest rate has gone up from 7.5% to 7.56% because now there is more money in the Canara Bank deposit. 51% of my money is now in Canara Bank compared to 49% in State Bank as a result of that difference in interest rates. Right? So my average interest rate is going up because there is more of the higher interest rate money now in my balance. And if you continue this process, let's say after 10 years, do the same kinds of calculations. I will now have 16,000 plus rupees here, 25,000 plus rupees here. Average interest rate has now gone up to 8% because now a lot more of my money is in the 10% interest rate bracket. Share of Canara Bank deposit has gone up from 50% to 61%. After 20 years, 71% of my money is now in the Canara Bank deposit and my average interest rate is 8.5%. Does this make sense? Because this is basically natural selection. This is all that there is. This is absolutely the process of natural selection in a nutshell. Nothing more than this. With one nuance that we'll come to. Why am I saying that this is natural selection? Now let me try to draw the parallel to what we biologically talk about as natural selection. So in this particular population, which is all my money, right? Each 1 rupee unit is like one individual in this population. Now, there are two types of individuals, the tall and the short, the long beaked and the short beaked, whatever. There are two types. One type we can call the SBI type, which reproduces at 5% per year. The other type is the Canara Bank type, which reproduces at 10% per year, right? Interest is the reproduction of money in a certain sense. So, we have two types of individuals in this population with different fitnesses, Darwinian fitnesses, as in they have different rates of reproduction. As a result of these differences in reproductive rate, increasingly the Canara Bank type of individuals begin to outnumber the State Bank kind of individuals, right? Their proportion went up from 50% to 80% in like 20 years. Eventually, almost all my money will be in Canara Bank type currency, not in the State Bank type currency. At which point the State Bank type of individual will have become extinct. Canara Bank type of individual is fixed in the population. The composition of the population has changed. And it has not just changed, it's not just that evolution has happened, that the composition of the population has changed. It has changed in a way that is increasing the average fitness. The average interest rate went on increasing from 7.5% to 8.2%, and eventually when all my money is in Canara Bank and hardly anything is in State Bank, the average interest rate will be about 10%, right? Because that's the interest rate of the Canara Bank type. So not only has evolutionary change happened, the mean fitness of the population, the mean reproductive rate of the population has gone up in the process. So this is a process of adaptive evolution. In the biological context, mean reproductive rate going up means you are better adapted to surviving and reproducing in this ecological scenario. So you are more fit in that sense to your environment. So the average fitness goes on increasing. So metaphorically in this particular case, if we use the same kind of metaphorical language we use in biology, we would say that selection in this population, that is my money, in this environment, which is this particular regime of bank interest rates that I arbitrarily put, we would say that selection is favoring the Canara Bank type of individual. Just like we say in this ecological selection situation, selection will favor the kind of individual that can run faster or so on. So this is natural selection. This is all that there is. Yes, yes.
So in case some adverse environmental condition appears, who will be more affected? Bigger one or the one?
That entirely depends on chance. What is the adverse environmental condition that appears? It entirely depends on what it is. The context matters. In biology, almost always the context matters crucially. In fact, there is a very famous statement by one of my mentors, Professor Michael Rose, who wrote in a paper that the only grand generalization that is possible about evolution is to say that it happens. Everything else, the context matters. Now, I want you to note a couple of things. In this example, the interest rate of a type represents both its rate of reproduction, how many new currency notes it produced, and its rate of increase, what proportion of the total population is now Canara Bank type. Okay. This is because when an individual, in my example, when a Canara Bank rupee reproduces via interest, it produces one more Canara Bank rupee which remains in Canara Bank. So the 10% interest rate of the parent rupee is inherited perfectly by the offspring rupee. Okay. So the inheritance of the interest rate or the rate of reproduction or the fitness, if you like, is perfect. It's 100%. All offspring of a 10% interest rate money type also will accrue interest at 10%. So this is a case where heredity is perfect. Offspring are identical to parents in their trait and their rate of increase, their fitness. That is why the rate of reproduction and the rate of increase both match. This is the one nuance I was talking about when I said this is all that there is to selection except for one nuance, and this brings us to the role of heredity. Now in evolution, a lot of confusion is created in the literature. See, fitness is used in two different senses in evolutionary literature. Very unfortunate and very bad, I mean terminology should be more precise, but fitness is used commonly for the rate of reproduction of a type. When we say what is the fitness of this type of individual, we mean what is the expected lifetime offspring production of this individual. That is the rate of reproduction fitness. But in many cases, fitness is also used for rate of increase. When one type is shown to increase in frequency generation over generation, we say it has higher fitness than the other type which is not increasing. So we use fitness for both. And the problem is that this connection between these two is provided by heredity. Heredity is what connects reproductive rate fitness to rate of increase fitness of the type. If heredity, if the transmission fidelity, the accuracy with which phenotype is transmitted to the offspring during reproduction, if the transmission fidelity of a type is high, both reproductive rate fitness and rate of increase fitness will be positively correlated and they will mirror each other and things are fine, like they were in the case of our bank example. But if the transmission fidelity of a type is poor, then differences in rate of reproduction fitness may not necessarily translate into differences in rate of increase fitness. In other words, the fittest, quote unquote, may not be the one that survives or persists in the lineage if the heredity brings in poor transmission fidelity. So here in the bank balance idea, the transmission fidelity was 100% and that's why this worked so beautifully. So now consider a variant of the bank example. So this time I have equal amount of money as before in SBI and Canara Bank, but now I am saying that the interest rates are the identical. Both banks are giving me 10% interest. In other words, both these types of individuals now have equal Darwinian fitness in terms of their reproductive rates. They are producing offspring at the same rate. But now imagine that every year, whatever interest money I gain in Canara Bank, I take it out of Canara Bank and put it into State Bank. Right? What's going to happen? Over time, more and more money is going to accumulate in my State Bank account. So State Bank account is showing better rate of increase fitness than Canara Bank. Money is increasing in that category faster. But that greater rate of increased fitness is coming even though the rate of reproduction fitness or the classical fitness is the same. That is because what I have done by this mechanism of moving all the interest money from Canara Bank to State Bank, what I am saying is that when Canara Bank money reproduces, its transmission fidelity is 0. It reproduces, but those offspring money are not Canara Bank, they become State Bank. So, here you have an example where there is no classical sense selection, there is no difference in reproductive rate fitness at all, but one type is increasing in frequency compared to the other and eventually will drive the other one extinct because of heredity. That's why I was saying from the beginning that in the process of selection, heredity is an integral process. It's not just differences in reproductive output, but heredity. So here heredity is driving the rate of increased difference. So more generally, even in the absence of any difference in rate of reproduction, this SBI money, as we said, increased because its transmission fidelity is greater. So in other words, differences in rate of increase fitness can be driven by differences in rate of reproduction fitness or differences in transmission fidelity or a balance between the two. Okay. So it's not just fitness differences in the classical sense of differences in reproductive output that drive the process of selection. Heredity is also there, and it is the balance of the two that typically is involved. Yeah.
Correct limitation in the species or something that is limiting the growth or the process of improvement. Limitation.
Yes, that is what in practice happens, because if some individuals in that species are having a limitation, they will not be able to survive so well, they will not be maybe able to reproduce so well, and therefore they, assuming that that limitation that they have is hereditarily determined, it is passed on to their offspring with some reasonable chance, then less and less individuals in subsequent generations will carry that limitation. So overall the species has improved in the sense of slowly getting rid of that limitation. So in general, the rate of increase of type is due to both its reproductive output and its transmission fidelity. And now please note also, transmission fidelity of different types of individuals in a population need not be constants. They could depend on the relative abundance of each type. One type may have a higher transmission fidelity when its frequency is 80% in the population, and lower transmission fidelity when its frequency is 30% in the population. In fact, if you look at traits controlled by Mendelian genes, that is exactly what happens in Mendelian inheritance. Transmission fidelity is different for different genotypes and is a function of the genotypic frequency. So it keeps changing as the composition of the population changes, and this allows for very complicated evolutionary dynamics. Because remember, it is the transmission fidelity which is mediating the connection between rate of reproduction fitness and rate of increase fitness. Now you are saying this connecting thing itself might be frequency dependent and very complicated. So now, how a simple pattern of who is producing more offspring than others translates into actual evolutionary change can become very complicated because of this complex frequency dependent variation in transmission fidelities. This is why selection, although it is an extremely simplistic concept, the way it plays out in nature, its consequences can be quite nuanced and quite complex, because the mechanism of heredity can be quite complicating in connecting who had the most offspring to who became the most common in the population. That connection is not necessarily straightforward depending on the vagaries of heredity. And now please consider, not all heredity is due to genes. There is cultural inheritance via learning. There is ecological or environmental inheritance, where especially in species with parental care, you will tend to inherit environmental benefits accrued. So if we are a species with parental care, I have some characteristics that permit me to accumulate lot of rich resources, as a result of which I get lots to eat and I am quite big in body size. Now in a species with parental care, my offspring also benefit from the resources I have accumulated, so they also get a lot to eat, they will also be bigger in size. So now there is a certain size similarity between me and my offspring, over and above the fact that I share genes with them, because I share nutritional environment with them as a species with parental care. That is what we mean by ecological inheritance or environmental inheritance. So different kinds of inheritance, genic, cultural or ecological, differ in the way they affect transmission fidelities of different types greatly. And so the evolutionary dynamics over generations of traits under different forms of inheritance, genic or non-genic, can be very different. This is one another interesting thing that comes out. So cultural evolution can follow a very different dynamic than biological evolution, even if selection pressures are reasonably similar, because the transmission fidelity patterns are totally different. Yes. Yeah. Are you familiar with Mendel's laws?
Yes.
Yes. It's a simple consequence of Mendel's laws. So, if an A1, A2 individual reproduces, even if it reproduces with another individual of its own type, let's say, it doesn't produce all the offspring as A1, A2. Half the offspring are A1, A2, 1/4 are A1, A1, which is a different type, 1/4 are A2, A2. So the transmission fidelity of A1, A2 is 50%, even when it reproduces with itself. As a matter of fact, the transmission of A1, A2 is always 50% regardless of frequencies. But consider the other genotypes. Supposing you have A1, A1 and it is reproducing at random in the population. It might mate with another A1, A1, it might mate with another A1, A2 or A2, A2. If it mates with another A1, A1, all offspring produced are A1, A1. 100% transmission fidelity. If it mates with A1, A2, half the offspring produced are A1, A1, half the offspring produced are A1, A2. If it mates with A2, A2, all the offspring produced are A1, A2. Now, how often will each one of these matings occur will depend on the relative frequency of these three genotypes in the population. That will determine what is the distribution of offspring types. So, transmission fidelity of A1, A1 and A2, A2 is always frequency dependent. Transmission fidelity for a one locus trait, one gene control trait, transmission fidelity of A1, A2 is always half. So, the transmission fidelities of each type are not just different. One type has a constant transmission fidelity, other types have a frequency dependent transmission fidelity. And this is where the complications in the process of how the selective process plays out come in. The process itself is very simple in terms of who produced more offspring. But then this mess intervenes between connecting who produced more offspring to who finally increased in frequency, and it's not always the same guys. That's the problem. So the transmission fidelities can in some sense make it that the fittest are not the ones who finally predominate necessarily. So classically, selection has been used to mean heritable differential reproductive success. Heritable here implying or assuming high transmission fidelity. Transmission fidelity that is sufficiently high that ecological success reflected in greater offspring production will actually convert into evolutionary success reflected in higher frequency of abundance. So selection has typically been equated with the existence of differences among types in reproductive output, classically differences in fitness, with the high transmission fidelity assumed to ensure a connection between higher reproductive output of a type and its increased representation in the population. But as we have been discussing, especially for genetically based traits, transmission fidelity is often frequency dependent, leading to very odd situations where despite selection, there is no change in the composition of the population. Some of you perhaps might be familiar with this example in all the genetics textbooks of sickle cell anemia. So sickle cell anemia is this one gene controlled trait in which the homozygote has severe problems because its hemoglobin is not properly formed. The normal homozygote is fine, and the heterozygote, who has partly deformed hemoglobin, actually does the best under conditions of high malaria, because the malarial parasite cannot infect its red blood cells properly. So you have a particular situation here where A1 is, let us say, the wild type. This is normal hemoglobin. A2 is the sickle cell hemoglobin. These guys are in bad shape, they have very poor health, they may die at young age, etc. And then the heterozygote, which has one copy of the sickle cell allele, these guys have somewhat messed up hemoglobin in their blood cells, but in malaria endemic areas, they are the best off in malaria prone areas, because this semi-bad hemoglobin gives them protection against malarial parasite and therefore allows them to survive better. So this is a condition where in a malaria prone area, the heterozygous individual, the A1, A2, the one which has one copy of each type of gene, sickle cell and normal gene, they have the highest Darwinian fitness. As a result of this, this is a classical textbook example, because these guys are the most fit. They can never become 100% of the population. If this guy was the most fit, after many generations, everybody in the population would be A1. A1 would be the only gene left in the population. It would be what we call fixed. But A1, A2, every time they reproduce, they have an A1 gene as well as an A2 gene. So both genes will remain in the population in a stable way. And when both genes remain in a stable way, what that means is that the frequency or the relative abundance of A1 and A2 genes is not changing over time. But selection is there. Darwinian fitness of this guy is greater than this guy and greater than this guy. So there are fitness differences. Selection by definition is happening, but genetic composition of population is not changing. It's not changing because the genetics is exactly cancelling out whatever is the effect of selection in this particular case. So especially for genetically based traits, you can have this kind of situation where the change in the genetic composition of the population, how many of which type, that is introduced by selection is exactly cancelled out by change due to transmission during the reproductive stage. And it is an interesting peculiarity of the Mendelian system or genetic system of inheritance that under Mendelian genetics, if selection is causing a particular change in the genetic composition of the population, transmission will always reduce that change a little bit. It may reduce it completely in some cases, like in this example, or it may reduce it a bit. So Mendelian genetics will always tend to act opposite to the direction of selection by at least some degree. So it slightly reduces the efficacy of selection to bring about change. But this is a peculiarity of the Mendelian system of inheritance. If you go to other systems like cultural inheritance, this is no longer a necessarily a condition. So in non-genetic forms of inheritance, it is at least possible that the pattern of inheritance, the transmission fidelity pattern, can work in the same direction as selection and speed up evolutionary change. That possibility becomes there. That is another reason why cultural evolution is often a lot faster than the biological evolution. Okay. So some of us have been suggesting for a while, as a result of part of this is slightly more technical, that we should differentiate between the causes and the consequences of selection. So the causes of selection would be an inquiry into understanding why in this population, in this ecological context, certain types are actually producing more offspring. What is it about them? This is the area of evolution where you are understanding the causes of selection, where ecology is important, where the entire organism is important as the entity that interacts with its ecological context. But then if you think of the consequences of selection, it helps to think about individual traits at a time, talk about whether that trait, which trait variant is increasing in abundance in the population, and so on. And we need to appreciate that the process of selection includes both these aspects, the differences in offspring production, the heredity which links them to differences in abundance or representation in subsequent generation. This entire thing is the process of selection, not just the first part. So in this perspective, some of us have actually been suggesting that we should stop using the term fitness in evolutionary biology for the reproductive output, and we should limit the use of the term fitness only to rate of increase of a type. Then if we define fitness in that way, then fitness differences will always correlate with actual increase or decrease in relative abundance. And this is a totally technical point, it's not important if this doesn't make sense to you, but this has the important benefit of rendering all fitness inclusive. This actually settles a long standing 50-year-old debate in evolutionary biology about direct versus inclusive fitness. There is no debate if you redefine fitness to that. The reason that debate has been happening is because some people are using fitness in the reproductive rate sense, some people are using fitness in the rate of increase sense, and then they are arguing by talking past each other. If you use it only for rate of increase, all fitnesses are inclusive by definition, and the whole debate basically gets not resolved but dissolved. Interestingly, and this is a point that strangely seems to have been ignored by lots of people in evolution, in this kind of formulation, if the fitness of a type is defined as its rate of increase, not as the number of offspring produced, then it explicitly fitness includes both reproductive output and transmission fidelity. And interestingly, this was actually at the heart of Ronald Fisher's fundamental theorem of natural selection, which he first put forward in 1930. And for some reason, people have not appreciated this, that this was always there. And we have sort of not entirely always been considering heredity as intrinsically being a part of the process of selection. Selection is not independent of heredity. In fact, the outcome of selection is the result of the balance between differences in reproductive output or offspring production and the transmission fidelity patterns due to the system of heredity. Okay. Going to stop here. Dr. Madhusudhan had mentioned something in the beginning, which is the foundations of genetics and evolution group. So this is the four of us, Professor N.G. Prasad, who was an alumnus of our unit, Evolutionary and Organismal Biology unit, myself, Professor Sutirth Dey from IISER Pune, who is also an alumnus of our unit, my colleague Professor T.N.C. Vidya, and one of my students, PhD student Satyabrata Nayak. So some of the ideas that I've been talking about in this talk, especially right at the end, are actually work that we have been doing as part of this FOGEC group, and this is partly the work of Satyabrata Nayak and will be part of his PhD. So this group is very interesting. This is an informal group, nobody funds us. We don't get money from anybody. We are just four people who happen to be good friends. We have our own research work, but we get together from time to time in our spare time and have a lot of fun working on fundamental issues in genetics and evolution. Why this is of some interest is, okay, so very recently this book has been published. This has just appeared about a week ago, and this is an edited volume. We have a chapter in this book, The Darwinian Core of Evolutionary Theory and the Extended Evolutionary Synthesis, the four of us. Many of these ideas are presented in this particular chapter. The reason this is important is that the last 20 years there's been a lot of churn within the field of evolutionary biology for what one might call, arguments about the very soul of the discipline. What is the conceptual foundation of evolution as we conceive it? Is there a better conceptualization that is possible. And for a change, there, through our FOGEC group, there is an Indian voice being represented in these debates. They are not entirely dominated by the Western countries anymore. And again, in this book, some of the biggest names in evolutionary biology have chapters in this book. This is the only chapter from a non-Western group. And this is actually important. The reason I mention this is because evolution is very neglected in India in general. People think evolution is something that happened, everything is done, it's not an active field of research. Even if it is an interesting field of research, it has no applications, which is actually not true at all. It has profound applications for almost every societal problem we face that has anything to do with biology. A few years ago, there was a paper by the FOGEC group with another student, Manan Gupta, at the time. This paper in 2017 was actually the first non-Western contribution to these fundamental debates, which is now continuing. This paper is still listed as being among the top 5% most discussed papers on the internet by Altmetrics. And this particular news was picked up by the DST, which is of course also the parent organization for two of us, because we are a DST institution in JNC. So this is from the DST blog in 2017, in which they wrote about this paper and this work and so on. Another thing I would like to say, so see, this is an interesting and rare event that Indian biologists are part of fundamental arguments and discussions going on about redefining the soul of the subject. This normally doesn't happen. These soul defining debates happen in the West, and we read about them later on and say, aha, this is now the new soul of the subject according to all these big people in America and England, and let's follow it. In this case, at least one group from India is involved, and between us we represent 3 different institutions. Similarly, this book came out in 2020. This is called Conceptual Breakthroughs in Evolutionary Ecology by a very distinguished professor from the University of California. So this book briefly describes 65 studies that the author believes to be conceptual breakthroughs in our understanding of evolutionary ecology, starting from Darwin's 1859 book and continuing on till about 2015. There is one non-Western study in this book, and that is from our lab, a paper called The Evolution of Population Stability as a Byproduct of Life History Evolution, published in 2003. So once again, there is one of these 65 is from outside the West, and that is actually from our lab in India, and 2 of these people you have already met as parts of FOGEC. This is Professor Mallikarjun Shakarat, who was then a postdoc with me. He is now in Delhi University. So the point I want to just leave you with is that, contrary to much popular belief, if you look at Indian biology's contributions to the growth of biological knowledge, actually the best contributions come from our rather small and reasonably invisible evolutionary biology community. Just imagine for yourself, if somebody, a big professor from America, published a book called Conceptual Breakthroughs in Cancer Biology, and one of the 65 was from India, by now you would be hearing about it 24/7 on all the news media. Similarly, another fact that people don't often realize, if you look at the area of experimental evolution, which is what my lab does, if you look at all the research groups around the world that use long-term experimental evolution studies as part of their strategy for addressing fundamental questions, almost 50% of the research groups in the world are in India. But because evolution is not popular in India, you will never hear about this. Again, imagine if 50% of all cancer biology research groups in the world were in India. Can you imagine the halla in the media about it? Oh my God, we are leaders, we are Vishwaguru, we are champions. You know, people would have gone bonkers by now. But it doesn't happen. So the take-home message I want to leave you with is that Actually, if you look at Indian biology, some of the most fantastic contributions to the growth of knowledge internationally are actually coming from our evolutionary biology community. Thank you very much, and I'll be very happy to take any further questions. Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned that there are uses for studying biology and species and all. Can you give some examples of them?
Wonderful. So let's think of some of the big problems we face today. One very big problem which maybe you have heard of is antibiotic resistance in disease causing bacteria, right? This is not a problem that can be solved by biomedical research alone or by molecular biology alone, because this is an evolutionary problem. The bacteria are evolving antibiotic resistance, and so this also requires an evolutionary perspective to approach. Problems of, last 3 years we've been in the middle of a pandemic because some virus has switched from some animal host to a human. And this keeps happening. Some years ago you had same thing with Nipah virus in Kerala 2 to 3 years back. Under what conditions do pathogens jump hosts? This is a classic problem in evolutionary biology. So again, biomedical research is not going to allow us to manage problems like the next zoonotic pandemic when it comes along. They're just not going to. Practically all the problems we face as a society that have to do with health, with agriculture, with disease, with the effects of climate on all of these, have a strong evolutionary dimension to them. The problem is that in India we don't teach evolution anywhere. If you want to do a BSc honors in evolution, you can't do it in India. You want to do MSc in evolution, no university in India has MSc in evolution. My department in JNC, which is a tiny department, is the only department in the whole of India that has the words evolutionary biology in it. Yet you have national institutes of cell biology, molecular biology, immunology, this, multiples of them. Microbial technology, cellular technology, genomics, not one national level institution for evolutionary biology. The result which you would see, which we have been suffering for the last 3 years, is when COVID broke, one of the things that became very clear is that in India there are no good epidemiologists. Why? Epidemiologists will not grow on trees. Epidemiology requires a very thorough grounding in population ecology, in host parasite co-evolutionary dynamics and so on. So it requires a strong understanding of the evolutionary and ecological dynamics of a human pathogen and the human host population. We don't teach these things anywhere in India. So where do we expect epidemiologists to come from? Which is why in India a lot of the epidemiological modeling of COVID was being done by people from engineering background or physics background. Some of it was reasonably good, some of it was frankly atrocious. And the atrocious one was what the government was mostly listening to, unfortunately. This is the tragedy. We are just not prepared to deal with these problems, because somehow in India we have fooled ourselves or lulled ourselves into this belief that molecular biology will solve all our problems. Actually it won't, and it can't. It really can't. By itself molecular biology can do some things and not much more. What we really need is a much better evolutionary perspective on things to make the best use of molecular and other tools to solve these problems. And that is where we are lagging behind in this country. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for the wonderful talk, sir. So, in the example that you related with the bank interest rate and the proportion of amount that's there in each bank, in the end, as the proportion goes, that's that particular bank like represents natural selection in some. So, one thing I couldn't connect there was like when we are talking about species and all, there inherently there's death rate involved with each of these groups. So if even if one group had greater reproductive rate and they died off quickly,
Very good question.
will all of that be accounted in transmission
Yeah.
fidelity?
Very good question. My mistake. I should have been a little bit clearer. My only excuse is because this was not a technical talk, I was slightly loose with my language. I should have said net reproductive rate. That would be technically accurate. So that is the net reproductive rate per unit time over and above the death rate of that time. That's one point. The second point is, again, I mean by analogy to the bank, consider the following. So let's say they both have equal death rates, which is 0, right? But now consider they both have equal interest rates, 10% compound interest. But one bank is compounding every month, the other one is compounding every year. Okay? In which account will money grow faster? The one which is compounding every month. After some time, all your money will be in that account. Please note that the overall per year interest rate is the same, the time of compounding. So this comes to another interesting point in evolution, that all else being equal, if there are two types which are producing the same number of offspring over their lifetime, but one produces those offspring all at once in the beginning of their life, the other one spaces it out across the lifespan. The first one will have the higher fitness in terms of rate of increase, and after some time that will be the type that predominates, which is why the most common pattern of reproductive output in the world looks like this. Maximum reproductive output in the early part of life. This is by far the most common pattern across all kinds of species in the world. Practically every insect has this pattern, and most species in the world are insects. This is why, because this, supposing this corresponds to a total number of 1000 offspring per lifetime, and this is one strategy. Another strategy reproduces like this, also produces 1000 offspring over the lifetime. This strategy will wipe out that strategy, simply because it's producing the offspring earlier. It's compounding at a faster rate. It's compounding every month, not every year. And therefore, even though the total reproductive output is the same, the rate of increased fitness in this case is much faster. Yeah. Yes?
Okay. Like a continuation to the previous thing, when you were talking about the transmission fidelity, you're like, if A1 A2 mates with A1 A2, the probability of is fixed, but then that's assuming that probability is split equally among the 4 possibilities. Is that usually observed, or is that like a theoretical?
The probability is split. If you take any individual sample of 4 offspring or 10 offspring or 40 offspring, it's a sample, it will approximate that probability, right? It doesn't have to split exactly. But Mendel's laws basically mean that that is exactly how the probability is split.
I meant like in the actual setting, is that usually observed, or do other factors change the probabilities?
No, if A1 A2 is mating with A1 A2, there is nothing else that will affect this unless you invoke things like maybe the A1 gametes are less capable of fertilization than A2. So you could invoke selection among individual gamete types or something like that. But beyond that, if you assume a typical situation, that is pretty pakka. Now the realization of those probabilities in any real sample of offspring is a different matter, right? I mean, if you have a perfectly fair coin with a probability of heads being half and probability of tails being half, any sequence of 10 tosses doesn't have to give you 5 and 5. So the actual frequency of offspring of those 3 types that will show up in any set of offspring from that cross, from that mating, is subject to realization of those probabilities, but the probability distribution itself is exact.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so I really like your lectures. I've been seeing all of them. So
Thank you.
I wanted to ask a question. Which books can I read about evolutionary biology? Because I'm interested in evolutionary biology. So which books can I read, and any people who I can interact with?
Okay. Bangalore is actually a good place to be because most of the evolutionary biologists of India happen to be in, or many of them happen to be in Bangalore. So there are 2 of us in my center in JNC. You're most welcome to come by sometime and visit our labs and see how we do experiments in evolution and stuff. And my colleague Professor Vidya, whom I showed you a picture of, so I do mostly work with laboratory systems, experimental evolution. So we track evolution in populations of fruit flies in the lab. I have fruit fly populations that are now evolving for almost 800, 900 plus generations under different conditions in the lab. Some of them have evolved the first steps of becoming different species, in that they are showing incipient reproductive isolation now after about 800 generations of evolution. My colleague Professor Vidya works on social behavior and social organization of elephants in Nagarhole and Bandipur. So she works with wild populations and with social behavior and all. She also does some work with social roosting in birds, why birds all come together to roost at night. There are multiple hypotheses, so she and her students have been trying to test some of those hypotheses, whether it is to exchange information about where is good food available, or it is to get protection against predators like owls or other predatory birds and so on. There are also a lot of evolutionary biologists in the Center for Ecological Sciences in Indian Institute of Science. Many of them are what we would call evolutionary ecologists. They are more interested in the evolution of particular behavior or particular traits or evolution of social behavior. As Dr. Madhusudan actually very accurately mentioned in the beginning, my interest is really in the evolutionary process. I am interested in the whole process of selection, not necessarily the evolution of claws or beaks or tails in some group or the other of organisms. But so yeah, I mean, you're most welcome to come and visit our labs and meet. In terms of reading books, let me ask you this. See, one of the nicest general books about evolution is actually The Blind Watchmaker by Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins, unfortunately, is far more well known for his other book, The Selfish Gene, which I would strongly urge you not to read. It's a very misleading book. But The Blind Watchmaker is actually a very good general exposition of evolutionary biology. That's, to my mind, the nicest, I think, general sort of popular book on evolution that I have come across. If you want a book that focuses more on the causes of selection, not on the consequences, so essentially ignores all the stuff with the transmission and heredity and talks about why different types have different fitnesses in different contexts, then there's a very nice book by our very own Professor Raghavendra Gadakkar from IISc called Survival Strategies. That was published quite a while back when I was an assistant professor. I think it should still be available. And that's a very nice book, but its focus is entirely on the causes of selection. It doesn't address much about the consequences. Okay?
So, quite some
about your interest in poetry. So my question is a little offbeat, but I'm really interested to know that, you know, when you talk about evolution, which nazm or which verse from what you've read comes to your mind, you know?
When I talk about evolution, nothing in particular comes to mind. When I look at different aspects of how we study evolution. So one of the things, for example, that I have always been interested in since the time I was a PhD student was I like to study fundamental questions in the subject, not superficial questions, however attractive or fashionable the superficial questions might be. Fundamental questions are usually unfashionable at any given point in time, because what happens is, in any fundamental area, people move in, they address some of the questions that are sort of the low-hanging fruit, then the questions become harder, and then they move on to the next fashionable thing. So it's the harder questions that remain unanswered. So tomorrow if somebody comes in and say, I want to work on this fundamental phenomenon, now only the harder questions are remaining. But I've always enjoyed working on these unfashionable things at the fundamental level that people are not thinking about. And what that reminds me of is a very well-known couplet by Mirza Ghalib, and I must point out as a sort of a parochial note, Mirza Ghalib is typically identified with Delhi, but he only moved to Delhi after he grew up. He was from Agra, my hometown. So Mirza Ghalib has this couplet in which he is referencing the story of Moses from the Bible and the Quran, of Moses going to Mount Sinai, Tur in Urdu, and asking God to show, God to show himself, and God says, I will not show myself because you will not be able to withstand that sight. And instead I will show you a small thing, and one bush explodes into a flame and Moses becomes unconscious and eventually comes back down with the 10 commandments. So Mirza Ghalib says, क्या फर्ज है कि सबको मिले एक सा जवाब, आओ ना हम भी सैर करें कोहे तूर की. The same insight is not bestowed on every contemplating soul. So let us too then take a chance and upon Mount Sinai stroll. So this has always been my guiding philosophy. It's fine, this is a fundamental question. Some great people have worked on it before. I don't think they have solved it properly. Why not I try to, I should also take a stroll on Mount Sinai. I might get a different reply than Moses did. So this has always been one of my guiding thoughts. The other couplet that often comes to mind is from my other great favorite poet, Allama Iqbal, which is when we define model systems in evolution. You see, it's poets and mathematicians have a certain luxury that nobody else has. They have the luxury of creating their own universe and enjoying it. Natural scientists are unfortunately stuck with the universe we actually have. We have to somehow have whatever fun we are trying to have describing and understanding the universe that we are stuck with. So we don't have this luxury of creating our own universe. What we can do, the closest approximation we can do in biology is work with model systems in the lab. And in that context, I often like to quote a Persian couplet of Iqbal's on this logic of A, using a model system, B, it has shades of the previous couplet also in terms of, why don't I take a stroll on Mount Sinai? Why don't I create my own universe which I can have fun with? So Iqbal says in Persian, Guftand jahane ma oyo batumi sazad, guftam ke nami sazad, guftand ke barham zad. In English, says, God asked me if I did find his universe to my liking and taste. When I said no, Then he replied, create your own and lay this waste. Thank you. Yes.
Someone gets some disease, and then if someone gets a disease and then they have a baby, will that baby have like an immune system to combat that disease and kill it?
As far as I know, it depends on which disease we are talking about. Some diseases, when people get them when they are pregnant, the mother's antibodies do pass on into the baby. In some diseases, they don't seem to. It varies from disease to disease, but it can happen. I'm sorry?
What if it's before they have a baby or
Well, it's again a question of, see, the reason you have an immune response when you had the disease, now you've produced antibodies against that disease, which will recognize that disease bacteria or the disease virus if it ever again comes, and those antibodies will go and bind to it and eventually it will be destroyed. Those antibodies will float around in the mother's blood for several months. So in principle, some of those could transmit onto the baby also, even if the baby was conceived after the mom had the disease. It's possible, but it depends a lot on which disease we are talking about, on how strong the immune response that was mounted by the mother was, how long it persists in her bloodstream and so on. But yeah, it is possible. Yes?
Why is it that evolution biology is not taught in India, and how do we overcome?
Why it is not taught in India, I have no idea. I think it's a historical accident. You see, a lot of these things sometimes happen partly due to historical accident, partly due to perception of what is fashionable, what is important. Part of the reason also could be that traditionally in India, I mean, this is not nowadays, not so much the case, but traditionally, you know, mathematics and biology were considered very different subjects. So for example, even when I was a student in school, and I mean, I'm old, but I'm not all that old, you couldn't take biology and mathematics in standard 11th and 12th. You had to take one or the other. And so a lot of people who studied biology in India were often people who didn't like mathematics too much, or in some cases who were afraid of mathematics a little bit, and so they took biology to escape from mathematics. But then if you want to really study evolution, there's going to be a lot of mathematics involved in understanding evolution. And that is one reason why often in college level and all, our teachers in biology departments are not very well suited to teach evolution seriously, because they are not comfortable with even fairly straightforward mathematics. And the theory of evolutionary change is a formal mathematical theory. So in that sense, evolutionary biology becomes a little bit like studying physics. You have to deal with a lot of formal mathematical theory, which is pretty sophisticated. And if I might, Dr. Madhusudan, I'll just correct one thing that you said that might perhaps be a bit misleading in the introduction. See, theory, serious theory in evolutionary biology is not new. It's certainly not within my lifetime. Serious evolutionary theory in evolution and ecology is at least 120 years old and has been very sophisticated from that time itself.
May I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
One is carrying on for that young person's thing. Perhaps you can give an example of where the mother's illness helps the child. Just an example, because you said sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. But on a different level, Professor Gadakar, when I asked him a thing, he said what you said, the blind watchmaker. And not from a sense of false modesty. He didn't mention his own book. As far as the example of bank interest rates are concerned, banks have handled that. So if you normally the interest rates that are advertised are based on a quarterly rate of payout. You can ask for a monthly thing, in which case it is slightly discounted, very slightly discounted.
Yeah.
But you can beat that because if you say that, supposing you don't want the money every month, if you ask that it is paid into your savings account, then even though the savings account may be only 2.75 or 3%, that's a little more than what they're discounted by. Right. So you make a little bit of money there. So for those of you who are counting your pennies literally, that might be a good strategy.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. In fact, I mean, just as a sort of a historical note, the relationships between economics and ecology and evolution historically are quite varied, and there are points of contact between economics and both ecology and evolution. Right now, for example, the whole movement in economics that is sometimes called behavioral economics, with which some Indian name or Indian origin names have been associated in the last 10-20 years. Behavioral economics is also often called evolutionary economics, and it is an attempt to apply evolutionary thinking, especially from non-equilibrium theories of evolution, into economics. Whereas in the past there have been many ideas and concepts from economics that have been applied in evolutionary thinking in the 1950s and 60s, particularly the use of optimization theory and game theory and so on. So there are interesting linkages between economics and ecology. But then if you look at it one way, ecology is really the economics of the natural world in a certain sense, in a conceptual sense. So it's not surprising, perhaps.
You didn't give an example of where...
Sorry. I have no idea. I don't work in that field. And I mean, frankly, I don't even have much interest in that field. As Dr. Madhusudan noted, I'm a strange biologist. I'm not particularly fond of organisms or living things or have any great interest in them. My interest is in ideas. And yeah.
If I can just add to that, Professor Gadekar used to head something called the Center for Contemporary Studies.
Yes.
And there, one of the presenters said that he was trained originally as a physician, although now he is more into matters of the mind, that all people being taught about infectious diseases should at least have an introduction to evolutionary biology. So leave alone the specialists who they may not know it. It's not only the epidemiologists, but even the practicing physicians.
Absolutely.
But unfortunately, they're not even given an exposure to it. At least
I completely agree. I think that's a tragedy. In fact, I would argue that a reasonably serious grounding in evolutionary biology, above just the superficial acquaintance you might get in a semester course, is actually important for pretty much anybody who is specializing in any area of biology, including medicine. But it is completely lacking. They don't even get that semester. And in India, for example, see another thing, if you, especially to students here, if you just go and Google up Darwinian medicine or evolutionary medicine, you'll be surprised at how much is happening in that field. Evolutionary medicine is practically non-existent in India. It's now drastically affecting the way we think about cancer, for example, and how we manage cancer. People have finally woken up to the fact that cancer is really, from the perspective of the cancer cell, an evolutionary phenomenon. which is taking place inside your body. And that explains many interesting things about cancer and how it responds to treatments that were a bit mysterious earlier. But see, again, the tragedy is, I remember that evolutionary biologists first started saying that, you know, the tumor growing in your body is an evolutionary phenomenon around the 1960s. It's taken the oncology community almost 40 years to sort of wake up to that and appreciate that, yeah, they have a point. And now, actually, not in India but outside, at least, how we develop strategies for treating, managing cancer and so on are now actually building in on some evolutionary understanding. But in India, there's hardly any work in evolutionary medicine at all.
Yeah, sir, this
Yeah?
is more of a basic layman question.
Sure.
Is this genome project, I mean, that's about a bit of evolution and genetics and all that. Is that in your line, or is it a completely different thing?
Let me put it this way. I don't have a great interest in genomic data because the kinds of questions in evolution that interest me are, as I said, about the process, not about the patterns or the past history. Where genomic data is very, very useful in evolution is in reconstructing ancestor-descendant relationships between species or even larger groups, families, phylums, in the past. What is often called phylogenetics, the construction of phylogenetic or ancestor-descendant trees based on genomics data. That is where genomics data is the most useful in evolution. I don't happen to personally have too much interest in that reconstruction of the past kind of work in evolution. But to those who do, it's very useful. See, this is also one of the interesting paradoxes about genome data. Apart from its use to reconstruct evolutionary histories, the advantages of genomics data in biomedical research, contrary to the publicity that you hear, are actually fairly limited. But that work is kind of expensive, so it has to be justified by claiming that it will give great returns, you know, because the funding required is very heavy, but it's not really going to give any major returns.
Sir, that's a bit of saying, you know, it is not that good. I mean, that's a message as a layman I'm getting from you. Yeah. So can you give some reason? Because like you said, probably a hype has been created around it, and we have been I thought that it's great because this is, for example, a genome project. That is something that has laid a foundation for the entire humanity across, with inputs from across the world. So it's not just that it has laid a map of framework for the entire population. Everybody has a lot of data to fall back on. This is what I thought. And you know, it's not just data, it's a whole lot of...
Let me quote to you a very, very distinguished molecular biologist, one of the builders of the great revolution of molecular biology in the 1960s, Sidney Brenner. He visited Bangalore some maybe 10-12 years ago. He was one of the number of people who got Nobel Prizes for their work in early molecular biology, you know, deciphering the genetic code and all that. That followed after the discovery of DNA structure. Sidney Brenner, in his talk, compared trying to understand biology using the genome sequence to trying to understand how a city functions by reading the telephone directory. And this is one of the founding fathers of molecular biology speaking, not me, right? And the point is, see, there are two reasons why this gets hyped, in my opinion. This is just my opinion. One is deliberate, one is non-deliberate. Deliberate is very simple. If I need a large amount of money for my research, I am not going to get it from the government of India if I say that my research will address some fundamental, very interesting conceptual issue in XYZ field. I will get lot of money if I can say that my research will take us 5 steps closer to finding a cure for cancer, or a cure for diabetes, or a cure for this or that, or it will help in, you know, increasing the yield of crops by 100 times or something. That is deliberate stuff. And this is a fact of life, this happens. This is what happens when the whole of society gets influenced by MBA type of thinking. This is what happens. Healthcare becomes a business, education becomes a business, scientific research also becomes a business, whether we like it or not. So if we want to change this, first throw out the MBA type of thinking, that everything can be thought in terms of costs and benefits and so on. As a society, we have to get rid of that kind of thinking, otherwise it's not going to happen. If overall society works in that frame of mind, this is one of the corollaries you will get it. Scientists will sell their stuff, and they will sell it with as much regard for truth as an advertiser or a politician does when they sell their stuff. Right? The second part is inadvertent. Many people come into biology buying into a certain way of thinking about biological systems which is very reductionistic, which says that, you know, the best explanation, the most important explanation will be found at the smaller and smaller levels. If you can understand everything that the molecules are doing within the cells, you will get a perfect understanding of the system, and more importantly, you will get a handle on the molecular mechanisms. The reason why that molecular mechanisms are so important is because that is the greatly beloved thing of the pharmaceutical industry. Pharmaceutical industry wants a molecular mechanism so that they can say, okay, this molecule is a key part of this chain reaction. If I can design a small molecule that will go and bind to that and stop it from carrying out this reaction, I get a potential drug. So simple molecular mechanisms are what the pharmaceutical industry wants. That doesn't mean that simple molecular mechanisms are how living things work. Right? Living things don't have to work the way the pharmaceutical industry wants. Living things work the way they have evolved to work. So the problem is that many people in biology genuinely believe that a very reductionist approach is the best approach. And so they take that logic further and say, look, if you have the complete genome, you have the complete transcriptome, the complete connexome, the complete whatever ome you want, and eventually I like to say that finally it will end up only in Hariom, you know, but you will get all of important understanding of biology out of it. A lot of people in biology genuinely believe this because of the way they are taught and the way they have absorbed what they are taught without ever questioning it. See, one of the things we don't emphasize enough about science is not about facts. First of all, science is about concepts. Facts are there, facts exist. You know, they are there, everything experiences those facts. Science is about how we create conceptualizations to explain the patterns that we see in those facts, temporal or spatial patterns. Now, because science is about the concepts that we invent to explain the facts, science is always provisional. Scientific understanding keeps changing, it's not fixed in time. How we understand, tomorrow we might come up with a better explanation, and if that seems to work better than the existing explanation, we'll change our so-called scientific explanation. Right? So science is always a work in, science is a process, it's not a thing, it's a process, it's a way of understanding the world in a rational way. And the twin pillars on which the entire edifice of science and all the benefits that we materially get from scientific advances, the two pillars on which that edifice are standing are skepticism and rationality. We have to be logical in how we evaluate explanations, and we have to be skeptical. We don't believe things just because Darwin said it and Darwin was a great man. Darwin had a very nice theory of genetics also, which is completely rejected. Nobody believes it anymore. And it was rejected within 15 years of his coming up with the theory by his own cousin, who was a great admirer of his, who did the experiments to completely reject Darwin's theory of pangenesis. But we think Darwin had a very important contribution. That doesn't mean that everything he said we will follow. What he said which makes sense, which stands the test of time and empirical testing, that we will follow. And the fact that he made many mistakes doesn't make him any less great of a thinker. Everyone will make mistakes. Newton believed in alchemy and various kinds of black magic also, right? But he was still a remarkable scientist. So that skepticism we inculcate in our school, college, everywhere. See, when I was a kid, I remember our botany teacher saying, A.C. Datta, this was a famous textbook of botany by A.C. Datta from Calcutta University. A.C. Datta is the Bible of botany. Now the minute you use that terminology, Bible of botany, you have subconsciously put something in your mind that A.C. Datta's book is not to be challenged. It is to be accepted as the gospel truth, quite literally. Or you have things like, Theophrastus was the father of botany. This we heard in BSc. We are a patriarchal society. When you say somebody is the father of botany, that means he should not be challenged. He should be worshipped and obeyed. This is antithetical to science. The point of science should be, and this, my father was himself an academician, a professor. He used to always tell us, even when we were kids, he said, you should not do something just because I am telling you to do something. You should do something if what I am saying makes sense to you. And if it's not making sense to you, tell me that it's not making sense to you. I'll try to explain why I'm asking you to do it in this way.
Yes, sir. The second part especially was wonderful, the way you explained. And reductionist is not just with everybody, it's every common man who cannot really get all the complexities. So if it is reduced to one molecule and that reaction and whatever, it's simpler for me, I get it. So that's with everybody. But the first part that you talked about, I mean, just for the sake of argument, I don't understand all these things, so I will go by your judgment. But then just for the sake of argument, you said it's like, going to the telephone directory. But we have the computing power to handle the directories at the directory level and without losing any bit of data. It's not like, 25 years back where we had to do it manually. So I did not get that part when you said, because the whole molecular thing, what are you talking about? It is about going to the level of directories. And what you said is, the other way around. I did not get that part really.
So, I mean, okay, I'm not sure obviously exactly what Professor Sidney Brenner had in mind when he made that comment, but I imagine what he meant was that if you are trying to understand a city, there is a lot more that happens in a city that cannot be explained entirely by who lives on which street and what is his phone number. That will not capture everything that is happening in the city. Similarly, the genome sequence doesn't capture everything that's happening even in a cell, forget in an organism. Basically, the genome sequence, see, this is an unfortunate reality, but a lot of things in our life are affected by the requirements, and I mean the economic requirements of the pharmaceutical industry, whether we like it or not. Unfortunately, this extends even into how we think about biology. Genomics will provide you answers for every disease and open the way to completely individual personalized genetic medicine. This is a dream being sold by the pharmaceutical industry to boost its stock values. It's not a biological reality, in my opinion. And if you think that I am being conspiracy theorist about the pharmaceutical industry, just consider, forget about how we think about biology, look at reality. 20 years ago, if your fasting blood glucose was about 130, you were considered normal. Then it reduced from 130 to 110, then 120. Then about 15, 16, 18 years ago it became 110. So if your blood sugar fasting is above 110, you are diabetic. Below 110 is normal. Now there is talk that they will make it 100. If you are above 100, you are diabetic. Now what does it mean when you are diagnosed as being diabetic? So every time this testing criteria reduces by 10 units, you add automatically by fiat, you have added millions of new diabetics to the world population by changing the definition of what is diabetic. This is like what we used to do with poverty, right? We used to eliminate poverty by moving the discussion of what is the poverty line. I move it here, now I have less people under poverty, right? So, once you are diagnosed as diabetic, you are now going to take some medicine for the rest of your life. So, whose interest is it in that lower and lower levels of glucose should still qualify you to be diagnosed as diabetic? The guy who makes those medicines, right? I actually looked into this very carefully to see whether there is some real biological research that came up as a result of which we decided that no, 120 is not correct, 110 should be the new borderline. Maybe that could be correct. It could be that there was really important new research that came up and now we appreciate that even 110 is diabetic. There is no such research, at least I have not been able to find it. And in today's day and era, I mean, finding scientific literature is kind of easy because of internet. It's not like, when I was a PhD student, literature search actually meant going to the library and looking at bound volumes of journals for the last 100 years and then xeroxing them. But today you could say, there is no great biological understanding that has caused this reduction. So basically, now actually if you push this to 100, it's going to start becoming dangerous because you are pushing the lower end. After some time, you're going to have more and more people suffering hypoglycemic episodes. And this has already happened in Western countries. There are now studies recording increased rates of death by hypoglycemia because doctors are pushing very aggressively for HbA1c levels to be maintained below 7. Because again, that helps classifying people as diabetic. So, many aspects of our lives pertinent to biology, whether it pertains to medicine or how we think of biology, how we teach biology, are actually seriously affected by the requirements of the pharmaceutical industry, which is one of the very big industries in the world. It's a massive industry in terms of this financial scale. It's also the one industry that has the most awful track record in terms of how many drugs that they actually come up with. So how many drugs that they start research on make it to trials, what proportion then make it to the market, what proportion remain in the market more than 10 years without being withdrawn due to adverse side effects. A small fraction. Why do so many drugs have side effects? That itself is evidence that the reductionist view of biological systems doesn't work. If we were really a machine which could be understood as a machine in a reductionist way, drugs wouldn't have weird side effects. They have weird side effects because we are not machines, we are living things. And living things are not meaningfully thought of as machines in any sense of the word. That's a very bad metaphor to use when thinking of living organisms.
Yeah, sorry about that question because I am a data analyst, so you can.
Not at all, not at all.
I'm just kidding. So, sir, one last question. So now,
if you want a personal opinion, I think the problem with data analysis right now, one problem, not the problem, one problem, is the same problem we have had for many years with mathematical modeling in biology. And that is the fallacy that data analysis in and of itself is a science. It's not. I would suggest to you or place an argument to you as food for thought. Data analysis, just like mathematical modeling, in and of itself is not a science, in the sense that it has certain techniques that you need to know. You want to do mathematical modeling, you have to know how to maybe solve a differential equation, that's all fine. But the fact that you know how to solve a differential equation doesn't make you a certain profession called a mathematical modeler. It makes you a guy who knows how to solve a differential equation. Now if you want to do modeling in physics, you need to understand physics and then apply your differential equation skills to it. Then you become a modeler in physics. If you want to model in ecology, you have to understand ecology and then apply your differential equation skills to it and then become a modeler in ecology. Just because you do good mathematical modeling in physics doesn't mean you will necessarily do good mathematical modeling in ecology at all. This is a very popular fallacy which most physicists in India seem to believe in. So there are so many physicists in India, it's like in the weekdays I am a physicist, on the weekend I am a theoretical ecologist or theoretical evolutionary biologist. I am really sorry, but that doesn't work. That way you don't end up contributing anything meaningful. You need to be like Fisher, who was also not a trained biologist, but he then got into the biology and, you know, contributed a tremendous amount. I suspect data analysis right now is in a little bit like this. You are thinking that if people, or not you, I mean personally, people are thinking that if you know these data analysis tools, you know some Bayesian stuff, you know some pattern forming stuff, you know some, you know, artificial intelligence kind of stuff, then this is a certain skill set which you can then apply to data from any field, and I think that's where the fallacy will turn out to be. I think if you want to be a data scientist in climate science, you need to understand climate. If you want to be a data analyst in ecology, you need to understand ecology, and so on. But that's just my view.
Completely with you on that, sir. I mean, I come across similar situations even at work. So one last question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So you said there are very less people coming into this area, especially research. So what would you suggest would be a good way to attract more people in, especially when they are young? You know, I was thinking, you know, now everything is, there's a lot of data available for everything. So is there a way that you can, or anybody can expose kids, maybe high school graduates, to data and then give them some meaningful projects which get them hooked onto it? And then, you know, I'm not saying everybody should become a scientist, but then building that awareness and building that minimum critical mass may help. So
No,
if you can anything suggest.
No, I agree, and see, I think at an individual level, certain individual scientists, certain institutions are doing this kind of outreach activities. I think they could be done a lot better, and I think they could be done in a way that people of my generation don't naturally think so well about, which is through maybe little short videos and stuff like that. I think that works better with many of the younger people today. Unfortunately, the problem is people of my generation, that's the last way we know how to communicate. When I teach, I prefer to take at least a 2-hour lecture at a time, because I think 1 hour is too short to develop a theme properly. So if I wanted to condense something into a 10-minute video, I'm not really well equipped to do that by basic nature. But these are some things that I think need to increase. I totally agree with you. There is little bit of such activity going on, and it would be good if there were places where one could find such stuff on the web which have some close to a guarantee of technical correctness. See, because one of the web is a double-edged sword. There's lot of information. I mean, as a kid who was a voracious reader as a child, when reading meant getting a physical book, which meant effort, I mean, I sometimes think, and it's like, my God, if I had internet when I was growing up, that would have been like paradise. You know, it would have been like being let loose in a candy shop. But at the same time, there's a lot of garbage on the internet also, some of which is dressed up to sound reasonably sort of meaningful. So how do we teach younger people? I think this is something that schools should really be doing, is how do you teach people to be a little bit discerning about information you get on the web? That's, I think today that's a very important skill now. Because earlier we could sort of take it for granted, okay, this is a textbook published by a very respected university publishing house. So that's some kind of guarantee of quality, technical quality. But today, some guy is putting up educational videos on quantum mechanics. I'm a biologist. How on earth do I know whether he's talking nonsense or, he's actually talking sense about quantum mechanics, unless I ask some friend of mine who is a quantum physics guy and say that, by the way, what's your opinion on these otherwise attractive videos? And sometimes you will get the response saying they're really good. Sometimes you'll be saying, don't even waste your time on this stuff. So, yeah.
Yes, sir. Our age is kind of, I mean, we are kind of aging out in a way, because now AI is coming in, and to some extent AI will take care of this sanctity of the, I'm not saying that is a panacea, but to some extent that will take care of it, and the younger kids will probably get better data and better info. But what I was requesting was, is it for you or maybe your fraternity, is it possible to put together some projects for these kids to start off, because they need help, in the sense not like lectures or things like that, because it's going to be again one more school, and schools cannot handle it, because schools are for a general stream, not for some kids who are interested in these ultra specialized themes. But then if you or some of your colleagues, or I mean, I'm not talking about even Indian, the fraternity, anywhere, if anybody is able to put together some simple projects that can get kids hooked onto this sciences, and then they do something that makes sense to them, and at the same time they get the hang of what it is, and it will serve a lot of purposes. One is that they'll learn the basic science around it, and then they will get interested in this topic, and then once you give that much, like I said, AI will take care of that, the rest of it, because they know how to navigate their way around the chat GPT or whatever it is. So is it possible for I mean, are you aware of any such sources of projects where they can get onto, or will you have some time to get on something like that?
I mean, I think there are some individual people who have been doing this in their individual capacities on a small scale in their vicinity. I know some people in ISER Kolkata, for example, have been doing this kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, I agree it would help. It's just that practically, see, what also happens is everybody is busy, everybody is busy with their own work, their own teaching, their own PhD students, whatever. I mean, it's difficult also to take out too much time for additional stuff a lot of times. And
we have two questions.
see, ideally everything should not be known. In fact, that is one problem with all the school and BSc level practicals in universities. We always know what was supposed to happen, which takes out all the fun from doing it. If you know that at the end of all of this you are supposed to demonstrate Hill reaction in an isolated chloroplast, and at the end of it blue color should come, right? Now what happens? If you are reasonably Indian and jugadu and smart, you don't even have to do the experiment. You take one test tube with chloroplast to the external examiner, sir, time 0. He will sign on it, time 0, no blue color. Then put one drop of blue ink into it after 15 minutes, go back to external examiner, sir, time t is equal to 15, blue color. He will say blue color is there, Hill reaction has been demonstrated. Now, what exactly was the point of this practical? I know what was going to happen, I know how to game the system. finished. I mean, it doesn't serve any purpose. Practicals ideally should be open-ended, where the student should not know what is supposed to be the answer or what is supposed to be happening. That way, there is some taste of figuring out something for yourself, as opposed to a demonstration. See, that way, the college practicals are basically demonstrations. The only lollipop being given to you as a student is you can do the demonstration yourself instead of lecturer demonstrating it to you. Ages of fruit flies. You need to figure out whether they are the same species or they are two different species. Do whatever you want. Tell us after 1 week what you figured out and how. That is an experiment for the student. Yeah. Sorry? This is a program called POBE, POBE. This is for first year BSc students. They apply when they are in first year, and then they come for 3 years in the summer for 2 months to our center during their first year, second year and third year. First year we do some teaching and some sort of more open-ended lab exercises. Second and third year they actually participate in some research project in somebody's lab. They can be in any area of science. There is a similar program in chemistry also called POCE, Project Oriented Chemistry Education, that is going on since 2004. Biology program started in 2006. Yeah.
Any more questions? No, right?
This one.
Please make it short.
Thank you, sir, for this opportunity. One question, I may sound very naive to most of the audience. I'm not a scientist or a science student, just an enthusiast. So I believe that evolution is it's happening forever, right? Even now we're evolving. So is there any change that you foresee or any change that you see in human body, humankind, that we will see a manifestation of it in, say, next 100 years or 150 years?
150 years you won't see anything much
Okay.
biologically happening, because think about it, I mean, what is the human generation time? 100 years is at best 2.5 generations or 3 generations.
Correct,
That's
correct.
very little time. The second thing is, but in principle what you say is absolutely correct. Evolution doesn't stop. It is happening, and you can track the signatures of evolutionary change among other things in genomic data. It's a nice repository of record, because see, so for example, now we do have the technical ability to extract DNA from very old samples, ancient samples, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 year old samples, and sequence them. So you can actually see at what genetic loci allele frequencies, for example, or the composition of the population is changing compared to 40,000 years ago. Right. How is it different today? What are those genes for? Which are the genes that are rapidly changing? Which are the ones that are not changing? And which of those changes are likely to be due to selection or just by chance? That there are statistical ways of distinguishing. So, some parts of the human genome are actually now, thanks to our modern day lifestyle, they are escaping the scrutiny of selection because the consequences are not there. See, both you and I are wearing glasses, right? 3,000 years ago, you and I probably would have not survived to reproductive age because we had such poor eyesight, we would not see the tiger and tiger would come and eat us. Today, with the technology, the fact that I have really bad eyesight doesn't prevent me from leading a normal life and having offspring also. But the flip side is that whatever genes were giving me bad eyesight are passing on in the next generation as well.
Correct.
So they are persisting in the population, but they are not having an effect because of technology. So those genes, the bad eyesight genes, let's say, are no longer under selection, for example. Some genes are under increasingly rapid selective change, and that includes a lot of the genes relevant to immune system, interestingly, compared to 20-30,000 years ago. Why that is so is not clear, but it's a very striking pattern.
So, if I may add one more example, I come from a family of businessmen. Supposedly, my grandfather, that is my father's father, was very good in maths. My father but then he started using calculators. And when I was a child, it seems I was very good at maths. But then over a period of time, computers and calculators and laptops and thereafter phones took over. And now we do not do mental maths.
Yeah.
So once we had a discussion at home and we realized that probably 3 generations down the line, people would have forgotten how to do normal maths. Like for my grandfather, it seems 23 into 23 was like normal thing, and he could have answered.
Yes, no, absolutely.
Yeah, for me, it will take me at least 2-3 minutes to actually figure out the answer.
Absolutely. I had this experience in 1987 when I first went to the US to do a PhD. At the grocery store, you know, you buy 3 items. It's like $2.50, $3.75, $4.10. So you go there and I'm like, okay, boss, so it's $9.10. This guy, no, wait. How did you know that? You know, and the guy would be zapped that you could add 3 simple numbers with decimals, and for us it was normal. I mean, when I was an MSc student, we used to do analysis of variance by hand. Today you do it by pressing a button on a computer saying, please do a 3-factor analysis of variance for me. And today's students actually in many cases don't know how to do analysis of variance by hands, which is a tragedy, because then you don't know what the computer is doing.
Right.
If you don't know what the computer is doing, how will you know if it's doing it correct?
Correct.
You know, but this is always the case. See, every time there is a certain technology which allows you to easily do something, you will lose some skill.
Right.
And which is in and of itself not necessarily bad, but in some cases it can be bad. I think it's good to be able to do mental math.
So one more short question.
I have no issues.
Thank you, sir. So one question. So now we have medicines or vaccines, which some call them as mRNA medicines, mRNA vaccines. Do you think they will change our DNA, or do you think they will change us over a period of time?
I don't think there is any evidence that they are going to do anything of the sort. Having said that though, I will just add a small caveat, which is that if one thing that biology teaches you over years of doing research in biology, it is humility about what we know and what we don't know. Biology does have a rather weird habit of sometimes doing very astonishing things that we didn't think would be possible. So there is a tiny chance that there might be something that we are not aware of that could happen, but based on everything we know at the moment, there is really no way that's going to happen.
Okay, so we'll wind up today's session. Thank you, sir, for such a wonderful talk.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Yeah. So we have a small gift for you. So I welcome Madhusudran sir to give you the gift.
Thank you so much.